For 5 days in May, Britain was gripped by an epic political drama.
On Sunday, I was thinking, I probably will be Prime Minister. On Monday, I was thinking, by the end of Monday, I definitely won't be Prime Minister.
It's a story of three men and the tangled relations between them.
I don't think Nick found him absolutely impossible. I think he found him a bit Gordonish.
He's a proud man, and I think, I saw immediately it would have been easier for me to have said that to him one-on-one.
Tonight we reveal what really happened behind closed doors.
In the Monday meeting, they were far more antagonistic, a bit dismissive, a bit arrogant.
I look around the room thinking, my God, what has happened here?
Look, we're only yards there from the windows of Downing Street. Gordon Brown is in there wondering what we're doing, and we have to make sure we are getting him out.
And we listen in on the calls which made history.
Nick, I have to do this now. I can't stay on. It's a choice one way or the other. You've made the choice.
I remember having to ring Samantha and saying, we could be going to the palace, you'd better get your frock on.
This was 5 days of drama that really mattered.
"3 a.m. election night. David Cameron should have been certain of victory. In fact, he was certain of nothing. Despite 5 years trying to make his party electable and the longest recession since the war, the Tory leader arrived at party HQ knowing he'd not done enough to secure victory.
It was a mixture of, obviously, you're exhausted because you've had an incredibly tough campaign. You're elated because the election's over, but just massively uncertain about what on earth is the next hours and next days going to bring. And yes, the sense that you might have come to the end of one thing, but you didn't have the certainty of knowing what the next thing was going to be. And it was a very strange sense, because nobody knew what was going to happen next.
We've been here since 10 o'clock yesterday evening, and no sign of any one party having a majority.
Before any new government could be formed, deals would have to be done.
This is the election that nobody clearly won. It's tantalising for David Cameron. Look how close he has got, but he's not quite there.
What we know is we're in for an extremely interesting night.
We're not going to lose any more Conservative votes.
This is what you couldn't see on the night. David Cameron totting up the results. A day before, his team had agreed that if they got more than 300 seats, they could form a minority government.
So 306.
But now, he felt differently.
It was going to bed that night, or rather that morning, knowing we hadn't done enough to win outright, and starting to think through, well, what does this mean? What are the possibilities?
He wasn't the only one who spent the early hours thinking about the numbers and the possibilities. Gordon Brown flew back from Edinburgh to London and soon left his allies in no doubt. He wasn't ready to accept defeat.
Gordon Brown was a master of power par excellence. Gordon and the people around Gordon were determined, so far as we could, legitimately within the rules, to stay in power. We saw this as a straight and very important competition for power between us and the Conservatives.
Hello, Prime Minister. Is it all finished?
Good evening. It's been a very long night. There's still a long way to go.
A long way to go, which he calculated could end up with him staying in Downing Street if Labour could form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
When Gordon Brown has made up his mind that something is desirable, doable and necessary, he just goes for it. I mean, he's a great snowplower. He drives his way through. I think he genuinely felt that his, as it were, his sort of last great mission, or, what the last great thing he could do for Britain was to save the country from the Conservatives.
186.
The man who was the clear and unexpected loser of election night would now have to choose between Brown and Cameron.
This has obviously been a disappointing night for the Liberal Democrats. We simply haven't achieved what we had hoped. You know, very mixed emotions. I mean, from a desperate hankering to see my children, I hadn't seen for a while, desperate need for some sleep because I hadn't slept at all, and yeah, disappointment, real disappointment. But all along, a sort of a sense of, right, I've got to grit my teeth now, however tired I am, however disappointed I am that we didn't get the number of seats we wanted. There's a really big task at hand now. People deserve to know what we think, how we're going to approach this, try and do it as kind of consistently and as openly as possible.
Throughout the campaign, Nick Clegg had insisted that the public were the kingmakers. Now he could no longer deny that, in fact, he was.
Nick Clegg, are you going to do a deal with the Tories?
Whichever party gets the most votes and the most seats, if not an absolute majority, has the first right to seek to govern, either on its own or by reaching out to other parties.
Watching him, his mentor, who, like many in his party, had spent a lifetime fighting the Tories.
It occurred to me that morning that the electorate had invented an excruciating instrument of torture for the Liberal Democrats. Our hearts went one way, but the mathematics went the other. And that's absolutely right. I mean, it was an excruciating. You know, if the electorate had moved 1% differently than it had, almost all those problems would have been self-resolving.
On the morning after the inconclusive election night before, it was clear that voters hadn't determined who Britain's next government would be, so politicians were going to have to do it for them. Both main parties had a shot at taking power, but both risked forming governments so weak they'd be thrown out in the House of Commons and forced to call a second election. It's quite a dream for a political pundit, but for Britain's top civil servant who prepared for months for a hung parliament, it was a nightmare.
We had individual civil servants playing the roles of the different leaders. And indeed, there was one infamous scenario 4, which was just like the result that we actually got. And the good news about it is that we therefore role-played it. The bad news is that we didn't actually succeed in coming to a good conclusion.
The reason that mattered was what was happening in Europe. On the streets of Athens, there were riots, and Europe's governments were divided over how to stop the Greek debt crisis from spreading. If Britain looked rudderless at this time, officials feared what some called a perfect storm. The markets would punish uncertainty.
What might have been a minority government wouldn't have the strength in Parliament to be able to pass the tough measures that were needed to get us through this problem. So the key issue then was that the markets would really make us pay a price on the Monday morning by selling our debt, and that would have been a real problem for the country.
The clock was now ticking. The civil service would provide advice, facilities and support for political negotiations. But the next move would have to come from one of the men who could lead a new government.
What both David Cameron and Gordon Brown understood on the Friday morning was it was perfectly possible for a non-Conservative government to be formed. The other parties would all be very likely to support, tacitly, a Lib government. So David Cameron was faced immediately with an anti-Tory majority in the House of Commons unless he produced a game-changer.
That is precisely what David Cameron had decided to do. Labour predicted that he would claim victory and attack the squatter in Downing Street. What they didn't anticipate was this.
I want to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats. I believe that we in the Conservative Party can give ground, both in the national interest and in the interest of forging an open and trusting partnership. I didn't think that we sort of did coalitions in Britain. But it's just on the morning of the election, waking up with the numbers as they were, the situation as bleak as it was for the country, it just seemed to me this is the right thing to do.
Opinion in Downing Street was divided. Most close to Gordon Brown believed that the Lib Dems would never fall for Cameron's advances. They thought the Tories had made a mistake. Most, but not all.
My reaction to that was what he said, how he said it, the overture he was making was actually quite impressive. I mean, it showed an openness to a sort of new politics, a sort of arch pragmatism. Others around me, including Gordon, all thought that it was a terrible mistake and showed great weakness on Cameron's part and that it was a huge strategic error. I must say I couldn't see the error in what he was saying at all. I must say I felt this guy knows what he's doing and he's going to motor.
The Tory leader had completely wrong-footed, not just Labour, but those Liberal Democrats who yearned to do a deal with Labour.
My first thought was that hasn't been dreamt up since 10 p.m. last night when the polls closed. That must have been in preparation. It's polished, it's clearly very, very carefully thought out.
The Tories are wary of admitting that they prepared for anything except victory. But before the election, they did detailed planning for a hung parliament, and their leader went even further.
David Cameron had mused out loud about coalition as a possibility. Did he talk to you about it?
I think only mused. We hadn't done any work on it. We hadn't thought what the consequences would be. Yes, he certainly will have said, you know, we might have to do that, or the country might need that, but we hadn't really planned it.
If they hadn't planned for this, it certainly didn't look that way. David Cameron was soon on the phone to Nick Clegg, on screen a reminder to express appreciation for how his opponent had handled himself, and to agree how negotiations would now start.
The first face-to-face talks between the Conservatives and Lib Dems are expected to take place tonight.
The two leaders agreed to send 4 negotiators each to the Cabinet Office, just yards from Downing Street. In the days to come, Whitehall, a road normally the scene of dignified ceremonial, would be turned into a rolling scrum of cameras, reporters and bemused onlookers.
The pressure on the men who David Cameron and Nick Clegg sent into this room in the Cabinet Office was immense. After all, they'd barely slept since the election. The room was said to be stiflingly hot. And just outside were waiting not just the Cabinet Secretary, but Her Majesty's Principal Private Secretary. The 4 men on each side of the table were left in no doubt as to what was expected of them. The markets were watching, and they wanted as full an agreement as possible, and they wanted it fast.
My advice to them, and of course we only facilitated, I want to get that absolutely clear, they discussed amongst themselves. I said that pace was important, but that it also, the more comprehensive the agreement, the better.
In other words, a coalition was preferable to a minority government whose day-to-day survival could depend on Lib Dem votes. The Conservatives seemed to agree.
And it became fairly clear fairly rapidly that there were not only areas of policy agreement, but that the Conservative team were willing to make quite real concessions.
That suddenly, actually, we could form a coalition with these people, and they are acting rationally, and they too want to put the national interest first. So pretty soon it became clear that this wasn't just one of 2 options, it was actually the leading option.
I could see, actually, from quite early on, when they came together, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, and they seemed to have a very high degree of trust with each other, that it was quite possible that it would evolve the way it did.
You could observe the rapport.
You could observe the body language, exactly.
The room they negotiated in looked out on the back of number 10.
If we had a break in the negotiations, George would say, look, we're only yards there from the windows of Downing Street. This is how close we are to being able to form the government. Gordon Brown is in there wondering what we're doing. And we have to make sure we are getting him out and providing a new government.
Hello, William, can you tell us how the talks have gone?
We've had an initial meeting, that's all there is to say about it at the moment.
And do you think you have the makings of a deal?
We've had an initial meeting, can't say more than that.
When the Lib Dem negotiators returned to their party HQ, they gleefully reported the speed with which their new friends were junking their own policies.
We felt that the fruit was coming off the trees so readily that we ought to go back with a shopping list of, people were saying, well, but seize the moment, guys, go on, they'll do PR in a second, they'll be doing electoral reform completely, we could have laws reform next year. I mean, it was becoming sort of surprisingly too good to be true.
The Tories were actually saying, yes, of course you can have that too. Would you like this? Because we've been trying to get rid of this for some time.
Labour didn't stand idly by whilst the Tories wooed the Lib Dems. They love-bombed old friends with calls, texts and emails in an effort to keep alive the dream of their two parties working together.
It was like a patchwork quilt where all of us were seeking to create this great quilt, but all working on different bits at different times, and then trying to sew the whole thing together.
I was talking to people I knew, Gordon was obviously talking to people, Andrew was, Peter was, we all were. Now, I don't know Nick Clegg, but I do know his predecessors pretty well. And I'd say to a man, they were saying, for heaven's sake, we don't want to get into bed with the Tories.
After the result, then I talked to Gordon Brown on 3 or perhaps even 4 occasions over the critical weekend. The message I wanted to get to him was that for me, and a lot of Liberal Democrats, the more natural position was to see whether or not an arrangement could be made with Labour.
There was, though, one conversation that really mattered. That between the Prime Minister and the current Lib Dem leader. On the night after the election, Gordon Brown called Nick Clegg from Number 10.
What he had to do was to make Nick Clegg comfortable with the idea of serving in a coalition, the two of them tethered together.
Gordon Brown do anything in that phone call to make the chemistry right?
I just think he might have given Nick more space, more opportunity to speak rather than to be spoken to. I think there should have been a little bit more of, come to me rather than I'm telling you where to go.
Was it a tricky conversation? A friend of yours told the media it was a diatribe and a rant.
No, it wasn't a diatribe and it wasn't a rant from Gordon. He spoke more than I did. He wanted to make sure his side of the story was heard as well. And I think, I didn't... and I've seen reports saying that it was somehow some sort of, acrimonious conversation. It didn't feel like that, but he was, that's fair to say, I think, he was keen to sort of put across his point of view, and I was just quite keen to explain the way I wanted to proceed.
Party leaders who clash in public at Westminster can still get on in private. Not Clegg and Brown. They'd fallen out over how to handle the scandal of MPs' expenses.
Nick Clegg found him absolutely impossible, didn't he?
No, I don't think Nick found him absolutely impossible, and I think he found him a bit Gordonish.
Day 2. A national commemoration will force the main actors in this plot together on a public stage. It's the 65th anniversary of VE Day. The 3 leaders set off for the Cenotaph for their first meeting since the last TV election debate.
You hopeful of a deal, Mr. Cameron?
David Cameron sensed he was making headway on a deal with the Lib Dems. Gordon Brown still believed he had the chance to gazump the Tories. And Nick Clegg knew whoever he chose, he would need his party's MPs and activists to vote for the deal. Publicly, all 3 said policy was what really mattered. Privately, personality would prove crucial.
I understand that relations between Clegg and Gordon Brown were never very good. Whereas, of course, with David Cameron, they're not quite 2 peas in a pod, but they come from very similar backgrounds. Public school education, Oxbridge, relatively affluent backgrounds.
But Nick Clegg could not simply choose who he might feel most comfortable with. Demonstrators besieged an all-day Lib Dem meeting held to discuss what the party should do next. They demanded a change to Britain's voting system and warned him not to sell out to the Conservatives.
But take it from me, reforming politics is one of the reasons I went into politics. Thank you very much, thank you.
Inside the meeting, old hands urged their leader to talk up a possible deal with Labour to lever concessions out of the Tories.
I said, look, if you were selling your house, you wouldn't just sell it to one buyer. A bit of competition would do no harm.
There was no possible way we could have a bargain with the Tory party with any chance of getting things through if we had not puffed up the possibility of making a bargain with the Labour Party.
That the people of this country are entitled to expect.
In order to puff up that possibility, the party had to start talking to Labour. So minutes after one of the Lib Dem negotiators said this,
We will be continuing our talks with the Conservative Party as the party with the largest number of seats and votes.
he and his colleagues headed for secret talks with the other side.
I mean, we were under huge pressure from Labour, I think, behind the scenes to have some sort of discussion with them, understandably, and we obviously didn't want the Prime Minister simply to chuck the towel in and you know, go down the road to Buckingham Palace.
The first talks between Labour and the Liberal Democrats could have stopped the momentum towards a deal with the Tories. But the negotiating team which Gordon Brown sent to Portcullis House, opposite Big Ben, was divided between enthusiasts for a deal like Peter Mandelson and those like Ed Balls who were deeply sceptical. Their offer was, as a result, a little vague.
You may be surprised, given that this was the opening gambit of a negotiation for a future coalition government, but no, we didn't have a document, a paper, an agreed negotiating position. I mean, we were sort of flying blind in that sense.
But the Liberal Democrats must have seen an extraordinary contrast. The Tories had presented them with a detailed policy document with 11 separate headings, with a series of compromises, and the Labour Party came in with not very much.
Well, the Conservatives may have been prepared for the possibility of a hung parliament and a coalition, which we were certainly not prepared for.
We'd had really no discussion in advance, and I don't think I even knew who was going to be in the room.
You didn't have a negotiating brief?
No.
You weren't going to make them an offer they couldn't refuse?
No.
Not only had Labour no offer to make, but also their leader had left London to spend a night at home in Scotland. Ed Balls had warned him that if he stayed in Downing Street, he would risk looking like he was clinging to power.
Good evening, sir.
Evening.
But David Cameron stayed put. He had an important date that night. The Tory leader went into a back entrance at Party HQ and then gave the media the slip.
We saw David Cameron arrive. I counted him in. I haven't been able to count him out. So the assumption has to be that he did go out of this building some other way, and who knows where he's gone. Nick Clegg, are you any closer to a deal? Where am I going?
No one was meant to know where he was going.
There was a bit of sort of jumping in one car and another. We eventually met in Admiralty House, in a room which felt, yes, very cloak and dagger. The curtains were drawn.
A building which had witnessed many historic meetings was now the scene of the first between two men forging Britain's first coalition for more than 60 years.
David Cameron and Nick Clegg decided they wanted to meet alone, so they swept past these great scenes of former naval battles, leaving behind them in the hall their party advisors and the civil servants who'd come here to offer support, and made their way into this small room, leaving behind people to wonder anxiously how they were getting on. Perhaps what they realised is that the key to any negotiation, the key to any deal between them, was simple: personal chemistry. Did you at that meeting have a feeling, because you were on your own, was that a moment you thought, I tell you what, I could share government with this guy?
Oh, I think by that stage I was thinking that things like that would be possible. We hadn't got any, by that stage, hadn't got anywhere near details or who would work and how and all of that, but definitely the relationship was good. We were getting on.
No, I remember thinking, yeah, this might lead further than I might otherwise have imagined it could do, and I think we probably both surprised each other to the degree to which we both appreciated that we were in a totally new situation and we needed to be flexible and open and pragmatic about seeing what would happen next.
You sensed, maybe I was saying exactly the same to the other guy, I don't know, but it felt as if this was beginning to click into place.
David Cameron and Nick Clegg sound as if they'd barely spent time together before the election. But this previously unseen footage reveals a meeting which took place many months before.
Well, he's easy to get on with, easy to talk to, and we'd spoken, I think by accident, when the government opened the Supreme Court. I think because the Prime Minister, then Gordon Brown, and the Queen were both there, they didn't really know what to do with the opposition politicians. They left Nick and me alone in this room together for about 45 minutes. Now, we didn't talk about, hung parliaments or anything like that. We just talked about politics and things, and I think that helped. So I knew that he was a reasonable person in politics for the right reasons, like me.
So long before the election, they knew they could do business. Day 3, and the Browns set off for church in Kirkcaldy.
Mr. Brown, a quick few words before you go into church.
I'm going to church.
That morning, the Prime Minister phoned an old friend to drum up support for a Lib Lab deal.
He felt that the Liberal Democrats were natural allies of his party and that we should work with him and not with the Conservatives. And he made that point very strongly to me, and I communicated it to my colleagues.
Were you surprised that Gordon Brown rang you, and why did he ring you?
We've always communicated very well, and I think there was a sort of mutual respect, and we found it easy to talk to each other.
Easier than he did with your leader?
Yes, I think so.
I remember saying to a prominent Labour figure at one stage in the course of the weekend, look, eventually these two men are going to have to go into a room, close the door and sort this.
Gordon Brown returned to London late that afternoon. 3 full days after the election, he and Nick Clegg were to have their first meeting. Their relationship was awkward, more so the conversation they had to have about his future.
On Sunday, it became a greater possibility that the deal could be done with Labour. The key impediment to this, however, was Gordon Brown. Everybody realised that whereas it might just have been possible to do a deal with the Labour Party, it would have been impossible to do that with Gordon in place.
Gordon Brown was desperate to keep his meeting with Nick Clegg secret. He couldn't, of course, go out the front door. He tried going out at the back, and the cameras had caught him. So instead, he and Peter Mandelson went by a different route, deep underground, squeezing their way along a tunnel used by Churchill to go to the bunker at the Ministry of Defence. For Gordon Brown, it was a journey that would determine his own fate.
A custodian opened a rather sturdy door. You then go down some very, very steep steps, and then you navigated your way through, accompanied by endless sort of pipes and ducts and other sort of rigmarole and paraphernalia.
The meeting in the Commons between the two men who would have to lead any Lib Lab coalition was no more comfortable than the journey to it.
In a sense, we were slightly talking at cross purposes, because what Gordon Brown was saying to me was, we can sort X, Y, Z policy issue. And I kept saying to him, well, I didn't doubt that on policy we could probably find accommodation on a whole range of issues, but that didn't address the fundamental issue that it wouldn't be seen to be legitimate in the eyes of the British public. And if it didn't seem to be legitimate, frankly, we would end up probably back having an election come the autumn.
The fundamental issue was Gordon Brown. He had to go.
Well, the fundamental thing was that the Labour Party had lost the election.
He had to go.
And that therefore it would not be easy for the British public to understand why a Prime Minister who had lost the election ended up being the Prime Minister again.
Now, Gordon's reaction to that was perfectly calm. He's a grown-up, perfectly realistic. He said, we need to think about that. We'll think about it. We'll come back to it.
How did he react?
Well, it was a difficult thing for me to say. I mean, you don't say something like that with any sort of relish. With hindsight, I slightly regret that I didn't say that to him just in person, and I did later say that to him, because he's a proud man, and I think, I saw immediately it would have been easier for me to have said that to him one-on-one rather than have it with other people in the room.
Clegg and Mandelson debated Gordon Brown's future in front of him. Mandelson arguing that only Brown could deliver a coalition deal, but Clegg insisting he had to be gone by October.
Gordon wanted more latitude, more space, and that, I think, created the impression or suggestion to the Liberal Democrats that actually perhaps he was angling to stay on not only for longer, but possibly even indefinitely, and that worried them.
Senior Liberal Democrats were being entertained at Paddy Ashdown's home that night. Many were still trying to oil the wheels of a deal with Labour. But a late-night phone call from a Clegg ally revealed what had just gone wrong.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, phone rang. David Laws said, look, it's a bit of a disaster. Gordon has reneged on the undertaking he gave earlier. Best he will do is say that he will go sometime in the next Parliament. Just think for a moment of the personal chemistry of this. You have wanted to be in Downing Street all your life. You've just fought an election which you've lost. And then the door bursts open and in comes young Lochinvar, who has outmatched you in the televised debates. He is the future, you are the past. I think for almost anybody, let alone somebody with those unique and not always lovable personal characteristics of Gordon when it comes to relations with other people, that would be a difficult thing to handle.
Early the next morning, Vince Cable had an unexpected wake-up call.
I'm not an early riser myself, certainly not 6 o'clock in the morning. I struggled to get my wits together very quickly when I realised the Prime Minister was on the line.
Cable had been a surprise and occasional visitor to Downing Street in the months before the election. There'd even been hints of offering him a government job.
He felt very strongly that we perhaps making a mistake. He thought we should be aligning ourselves with him, and I had to make the case to him as best I could, at half awake, was that the arithmetic didn't work. And that it would be very difficult to work with him as party leader. So it wasn't done in any sense of personal acrimony, but just spelling out the facts of life.
Here comes the Prime Minister. Let's hear what he's got to say.
The reason that we have a hung parliament is that no single party and no single leader was able to win the full support of the country. As a leader of my party, I must accept that that is a judgment on me. I therefore intend to ask the Labour parties to set in train the processes needed for its own leadership election.
Gordon Brown had resigned to remove himself as an obstacle to a coalition deal. When Nick Clegg was told the news, he reacted in a way which made some believe that a deal with Labour was what he really wanted.
Prime Minister was on the phone to Nick Clegg. Loads of other people, myself, Peter, picked up phones to listen. And Nick Clegg said, in terms, he said that, of course we should proceed on this basis. Of course Labour and the Liberal Democrats should seek to reach an agreement. We are, after all, the two progressive parties of British politics. And if, and I'm clear, if my party sees me reach an agreement with the Conservatives, he said, I'm going to have my members leaving in droves. He said, that is why we must make this work.
Labour were back in the game.
What an extraordinary day. It's all changed just in the last hour.
It's an audacious bid by Gordon Brown to keep Labour in power.
With the Gordon Brown issue resolved, two of his closest advisers took to the airwaves to sell the idea of a Lab-Lib coalition.
On the Monday evening, I believed there was all to play for and that there was a very good prospect of a Labour-Lib Dem coalition being negotiated.
David Cameron stopped a meeting of his shadow cabinet to watch Gordon Brown resign. The Tory leadership had spent 13 long years in opposition and now feared that the wilderness years might not end. What they realised is that they had to up their offer. They had to convince the Lib Dems to join them, not Labour, in coalition. The price they would have to pay was electoral reform.
I knew that for the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition government, they had to get something on electoral reform. It is one of their #1 priorities. And I was concerned that the shadow cabinet, and indeed the parliamentary party of the Conservatives, would not be able to accept that.
David Cameron summoned his MPs to a meeting in Committee Room 14 of the Commons. He needed their backing for something he knew they didn't want to give.
What Tory MPs heard that night has left a long legacy of mistrust. He told them that Gordon Brown had offered Nick Clegg not just a coalition government, but a change in the voting system without the need for a referendum. Therefore, they had no choice, he said. A referendum was the minimum price for the Conservatives to get back into government. There was just one problem with it. It turns out it wasn't true. Didn't you mislead your MPs then by saying Labour will give them voting reform without a referendum?
No, because I was absolutely certain in my own mind that was the case. And I had, I think, good reason to be certain. I had a number of people had told me what they thought was going on, and conversations that were taking place about AV without a referendum. And also I'd had a conversation with Nick when I'd argued very vigorously that you couldn't do alternative vote without a referendum. It would be wrong.
If Conservative MPs think they've been misled into backing a referendum because you told David Cameron, look, we can get this change without one, you're saying that's wrong?
To be fair, I think that's not, in a sense, what the kind of perception. The perception, which I think is accurate, was that there was discussions around, and it might have been an offer that might have been made and might have been considered. In answer to your direct question, was it ever formally made to me? No, it was not formally made to me.
For the Tory leadership, the offer was the last throw of the dice.
That was the deal maker or the deal breaker, and our party understood that when we put it to them, and I therefore went out and made the offer of a referendum. We will offer to the Liberal Democrats in a coalition government the holding of a referendum on the alternative vote system. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
David Cameron had bounced his party into backing a referendum, but he returned home that night fearing it still wouldn't be enough.
I remember going home, I think, on Monday evening, and I think Sam and I had supper in the kitchen. And I remember saying to her, you know, it's not going to happen. I'm going to be leader of the opposition. And I remember saying, I want to go on being leader of the opposition. I think we can defeat this new government. I'm depressed that it hasn't worked out as we wanted, but we behaved in the right way. We made them a big, generous offer to have a coalition government. They're going with the other lot. We're going to fight them all the way. And I thought, that's it. I'm going to be in opposition for a couple more years.
If Labour were to keep the keys to number 10, they now needed to hammer out a coalition agreement of their own. Gordon Brown sent a team of 5 negotiators into talks. The first time Labour had met the Lib Dems, little had been achieved. This time had to be different.
Within like less than half an hour, I was getting text messages from Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy saying it's not going very well. And I'm thinking, well, that's a bit odd because they're not there and I'm not there. And they were obviously being somebody was emailing them or texting them from inside the meeting.
Something clearly wasn't working.
Those discussions on Monday were pretty hideous from our perspective.
In the Monday meeting, they were far more antagonistic, a bit dismissive, a bit arrogant.
And there was a feeling, I thought, of both arrogance and resentment on the part of some of the team.
I think we were taken aback by how they sort of arrogantly thought they were the demanders.
A surprise demand from the Lib Dems came over the question of spending cuts. Just days before, Clegg and his party had been telling voters that cuts now would damage the recovery. They did an abrupt U-turn and asked Labour to agree to immediate spending cuts.
I was astonished, if I'm honest, because you know, it didn't occur to me that they would think for a moment they could hold their party together on such a sort of massive breach of the manifesto.
Did you change your mind about cuts this year in this 5 days?
No, I changed my mind earlier than that. Firstly, remember, between March and the actual general election, a financial earthquake, you know, occurred on our European doorstep.
But forgive me, in the election you didn't say, things have changed, I'm in favour of cuts now.
To be fair, we were all, I think, reacting to very, very fast-moving economic events.
We were in this discussion, we went in thinking we'd done the work, proper conversation. They were quite hostile and aggressive about it. We came out and thinking, well, that's not serious, that's not going to work.
It was a good discussion, it was positive, it was constructive, and we'll talk again in the morning. This is obviously very important, and important to get it right.
At the end of another extraordinarily long day, Nick Clegg met his party again. They decided to reject any deal short of a coalition.
Well, we're just going into another meeting.
Are you leaning now more towards Labour, do you think?
We'll try and make everything as clear as possible, as soon as possible. Watch it, watch the step.
The uncomfortable choice they now faced was whether to join a Labour-led or a Tory-led government.
It was an emotionally very sort of turbulent time, and as somebody who'd spent all my political life fighting the Conservatives, it was quite difficult to face the fact that we might be working with them in a coalition arrangement.
Many assume that Cable was opposed to a Tory deal, so his words that night were crucial.
My heart was pulling one way and my head was pulling another, and I think we were all torn in that kind of way. But the point I made to them was that the decision you have to make has to be the right one for the country and the party.
Did you ever think it might be right for the party, but I can't be part of it?
Yes, I certainly did reflect on my own role in it.
By the small hours, the waiting journalists were being driven to distraction by the lack of news and sleep.
Is it AV or PR? Which way are you inclined to go, Labour or Tory? Anyone think of any other questions? Because I can't. Deal or no deal? Left or right? Red or blue?
By day 5, everyone thinks a deal is close, but no one seems sure which one.
Can you trust the Liberal Democrats? I mean, you know, they're behaving like every harlot in
We are
history.
on a knife edge, as one senior Liberal Democrat
as they discuss whether to form a government with the Conservatives or Labour.
So it is now, I believe, decision time for the Liberal Democrats, and I hope they make the right decision that will give this country the strong, stable government that it badly needs, and it badly needs quickly.
But coalition agreements between rival parties aren't easy to make quickly. The changing of the political guard can take many weeks in other countries, as detailed policy agreements need to be hammered out and then approved by each party. But here on day 5, people were reaching the end of their tether.
If you had to design the worst possible context for conducting the formation of a government, the context in which we do it in Britain would be it. Everyone is shattered, tired. They're also lumped together in the centre of Whitehall with helicopters whirring overhead, journalists surrounding their every move, with it being almost impossible to get in and out of 10 Downing Street without being literally attacked by a whole bevy of television cameras.
All may have seemed unclear on the morning of the 5th day, but in truth, this was the fog of political war. Gordon Brown's going had opened up the possibility of a coalition between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, but it had also removed the one man with the will and the authority to make it happen. And so David Cameron and Nick Clegg now realised that if there was to be any deal, it had to be between them.
I remember having a conversation with David Cameron, and that was a very important telephone conversation. We both said, no, look, we've got to just do better than that. Either go the whole hog, make the big compromises, really make this work, or frankly, it's not worth it at all. I think in our own separate ways, we came to the same conclusion that you can't kind of half do this. You either do it and do it properly, or you don't do it at all.
Nick Clegg may have made up his mind, but he still didn't have a deal with the Tories or his party's backing for it. He needed Gordon Brown to stay in office until he did. That afternoon, there were a series of phone calls between Brown and Clegg, the Lib Dem leader asking for more time. But Gordon Brown and his allies sensed that any hope of a deal between them was at an end.
All of us were becoming increasingly frustrated by the way in which Nick Clegg was playing this, because it was sort of, we didn't think it was genuine, and we thought Gordon was being used.
I did ask him just to hold on, and that I just thought there was a sort of constitutional propriety, if you like, given that he was the acting Prime Minister, to wait to see whether a stable government could be formed before he went to the palace.
And we thought that was not fair, and that he ought to be able to leave Downing Street with dignity.
And I didn't think it was right, and I still don't think it was right, to fit simply for one person in that sort of triangle, if you like, to suddenly unilaterally declare, I'm fed up with this, I'm going to pull the plug on the whole process.
For the Lib Dem negotiators, it was now a race against time. Could they hammer out a deal with the Tories before Gordon Brown's patience snapped?
We occasionally would have civil servants popping in with their heads around the door saying, we've got a very upset Prime Minister who, we're trying to hold on to, but is going to be off to Buckingham Palace any moment.
Gordon Brown's advisers were desperate to ensure that he didn't resign in the dark. They feared that he'd look like a burglar, leaving the scene of a crime. But the palace wanted him to stay until the Tories and Lib Dems had done a deal, as the Queen's private secretary made clear to Peter Mandelson.
I spoke to him in the corridor and said, look, this is really getting quite difficult for the Prime Minister. And he said, look, I fully understand. Nobody likes it, but equally, the Prime Minister has a constitutional obligation and duty to remain in his post until the Queen is able to ask somebody, either Gordon or an alternative, to form an administration. He'll have to wait a bit longer until things become clearer.
But when Nick Clegg called back at 5:30, Gordon Brown had had enough. The call was witnessed by a single photographer and by a handful of advisers, amongst them Alistair Campbell, who wrote a note of the conversation in his diary.
Clegg called and asked for more time, then again, but finally GB said, time for what? Unless you can tell me you've broken off talks with the Tories in favour of discussion with us, I'll assume you're going with the Tories. I'm now in an impossible position. I have to go to the palace. Nick, I have to do this now. I can't stay on. It's a choice one way or the other. You've made the choice. I'm not going to hold on. The final words were, OK, thanks Nick, goodbye. Then he turned to us and said, OK, let's do it.
Gordon Brown's decision to call time caught the civil service, the palace and David Cameron on the hop.
I remember having to ring Samantha and saying, you know, what are you doing? And she was doing Nancy's homework. And I said, well, we could be going to the palace. You'd better get your, get your frock on.
Gordon Brown now prepared to leave Downing Street for the last time and assembled his staff to say farewell.
And then Sarah and the boys arrived, and I think it was Fraser who shouted out, "Come on, Daddy, we're going." And then people just laughed at that, and Gordon spoke, made a very nice speech to the staff. It was the end of a long campaign, and a long and pretty torturous and exhausting few days. So there were quite a lot of people in tears at that point. I think for us, it was 13 years, we'd been in power, and you knew this was it.
Here at number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister is about to come out and announce, we think, here he comes.
I've informed the Queen's private secretary that it's my intention to tender my resignation to the Queen. In the event that the Queen accepts, I shall advise her to invite the Leader of the Opposition to seek to form a government. Above all, I want to thank Sarah for her unwavering support as well as her love, and for her own service to our country. I thank my sons, John and Fraser, for the love and joy they bring to our lives. And as I leave the second most important job I could ever hold, I cherish even more the first, as a husband and father. Thank you, and goodbye.
Prime Minister Gordon Brown, his voice slightly cracking as he played a tribute to his wife Sarah. Goes back into number 10 briefly. The children come out.
It was a liberation as well as painful. His duty and his desire to do the right thing made him want to stay if he possibly could, and at the point where it was clear it wasn't, it was right, okay, I'm done. I'm out. I'm gone. I'm liberated. I can go and be me. And I think there was part of him which felt, well, you know, I can go with dignity. And he was not going to have Nick Clegg take that away from him.
I remember standing next to George Osborne as we watched Gordon disappear off down the Mall to put in his resignation. I looked around the room thinking, my God, what has happened here? We've ended up in a situation where we could well have a Lib Dem Tory coalition, which I never expected was likely to happen. We've changed the government. The future of British politics is going to be very, very different. Are we doing the right thing or the wrong thing? I mean, there's a sense both of excitement and fear, in a way.
The Lib Dems decided that they wanted to go with the Conservatives. They then created alibis as to why they did, that it wasn't possible to do it because of the numbers, because of the body language of our negotiators, but these were essentially alibis. They had taken a decision to go in with the Conservatives. It was a perfectly honourable decision for them to have taken, but there's no point trying to blame it on others. It was a decision that they took themselves.
The car carrying David Cameron is coming down the Mall towards Buckingham Palace.
David Cameron would be Britain's next Prime Minister, but he still couldn't be sure if he'd be governing alone or sharing power.
It meant then there was a bit of a scramble. And in fact, while David Cameron was on his way to the palace, Nick Clegg and I were still changing in our handwriting the coalition agreement at the last minute.
And so I went to see Her Majesty, and she asked me to form a government, and I said I couldn't be totally sure about what sort of government I was going to form. I said that I hoped to form a coalition government, but I might have to come back in the morning and tell her it was something rather different. I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. This is going to be hard and difficult work. A coalition will throw up all sorts of challenges, but I believe together we can provide that strong and stable government that our country needs. Thank you very much. It happened so quickly, and I hadn't expected things to happen that night. So it was quite unexpected and quite a strange feeling. And I remember sort of walking through that and ending up in the office, just just there. And at that moment thinking, you know, right, this really has happened.
Waiting for him on the other side of that famous black door was the Cabinet Secretary, who felt that he'd achieved his goal of a swift, smooth transition of power.
It was one of those events that just sheer relief that we got one out and the other one in, to be perfectly honest, within half an hour. And finally, there was a Prime Minister, not after 40 days, but after 5, actually coming through the door and clear that we would almost certainly have a full coalition government.
Next into Downing Street was William Hague, a man who'd led the process of compromise to end the Tories' long years in opposition.
I'm not a very emotional person, as I think the country knows. But I was thinking of 13 years before. I was the last Conservative cabinet minister to look at the cabinet room as we walked out. And being there again, able to think again about what we'll actually do for the country instead of talking about it for 13 years was a very exciting moment. And to come to power in those circumstances, of course, was dramatic.
Nick Clegg had gone from dismay on election night to Deputy Prime Minister in just 5 days.
I was aware that we had achieved something extraordinary, that we were kind of walking through a door to something completely new. I was absolutely convinced we'd done it for the right reasons, but immense uncertainty about what would happen next.
David Cameron's boldness had secured power for his party, but only at the price of abandoning some of their cherished aims.
I would rather have a majority government. It's what I was aiming for, fighting for. It's what I've devoted the last 5 years of my life to. But when fate deals you a different hand, you've got to play it to the best of your ability.
Their political marriage may look blissful, but the relatives of the happy couple are growing increasingly restless.
You know that old thing, if you have a dog, then eventually, for long enough, eventually you begin to look like your pet. Well, if you have a coalition partner, then it seems to me there's a very grave risk eventually you'll come to look like him.
That's an anxiety shared on both sides of this coalition. Many are simply waiting for it to fail. Others, though, predict that the politics of compromise and deal-making may be here to stay.
I think that the possibility exists for coalition politics to be a feature of British democracy for some time, and therefore we in the Labour Party have got to be thinking alliance, coalition, partnership, because that may be the only way in which we get back into power, or it may be the next way we get back into power. We'll see.
Throughout my political lifetime, certain truths have seemed self-evident. Hung parliaments would lead to instability. Coalitions, they did those abroad, didn't they? And the parties of the centre and left would surely one day come together. But those 5 heady days in May changed all of that. Now, this coalition may fail, and if it does, politics may revert to normal. But if it doesn't, the decisions taken by men who were exhausted, who were under huge personal, political and economic pressure, may well have changed British politics for good.
The US senator inquiring into the Lockerbie bombing says his committee will come to Britain to interview government witnesses. And we have the leaked document which outlines sweeping changes to the welfare system. Newsnight, 10:30, BBC 2.